Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to do my first video for Herstoryathon, just giving you a little bit of a catch up of all of the Women's History Month books that I have read since last Herstoryathon, so everything that I've read between April 2024 to the end of February 2025. And I'm not going to lie to you, I'm a little bit disappointed with myself because when I actually looked back at my reading over the year, I only managed to read 11 books that were either non-fiction or fiction that were about a woman of the past. Or at least she was the main focus of the book. And yeah, that kind of irritated me. Didn't know what's going on with my reading, but apparently that wasn't the focus. And so that's the very reason that I enjoy Herstoryathon so much, is it really puts those books back onto my radar. But without much further ado, let's just get straight into talking about these 11 books. First book that I read was actually a children's picture book, which was Mary and Frankenstein, The True Story of Mary Shelley by Linda Bailey, which is just this gorgeous children's picture book about the life of Mary Shelley and her creation of the novel Frankenstein. It is dark and gothic and spooky, but still very much appropriate for children. Obviously a lot of slightly less child-friendly aspects of her life are taken out, but I think what children would get from this is this inspiring story about a very talented young girl who defied expectations and created something wonderful and groundbreaking at a time when that was not really the expectation of young girls. The second book that I read was non-fiction history, and it was Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I by Tracy Borman. This is a dual biography going chronologically through the lives of the mother-daughter pair Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, and kind of contrasting the two women, this mother-daughter pair who were only in each other's lives for the first 2.5 years, but especially Elizabeth was so influenced by her mother, both aspects of her mother's personality that she really emulated, her intelligence, her wit, her political acumen, but also aspects of her personality that she decided to avoid, as Elizabeth was much more about self-preservation, Elizabeth being much calmer in her manner, a lot less hot-headed, and I would argue a little bit more methodical, and that really helped her to survive in this very brutal Tudor world. I found it really informative looking at these two women who, you know, I've always connected in my mind, but actually really being able to get down to nitty-gritty details of like personal effects of Anne Boleyn that Elizabeth was able to keep, and really drawing out these aspects of their personalities as well as the differences. I really don't think that you can do an accurate portrayal of Elizabeth without heavy reference to her mother, because the influence is just so clear. Next up was historical fiction. It was The King's Mother by Annie Garthwaite. This was, for me, the long-awaited sequel to her first book, Cecily, looking at the life of Cecily Neville, who was wife to Richard, Duke of York, and would go on to be the mother of two kings of England, Edward IV and Richard III. This is looking particularly at the reigns of her two sons, the messy political dynamics, the later half of the Wars of the Roses. Annie Garthwaite's Cecily is very pragmatic, a very complex character, and I think what I appreciated the most about this was seeing her interactions with the other women of the Tudor court. Prior to reading the first book, Cecily, I didn't really know very much about Cecily Neville at all, and now I find her to be one of the most interesting figures of the Wars of the Roses. Blood, Fire and Gold by Estelle Perranque is another kind of dual biography featuring Elizabeth I, but this time contrasting her to Catherine de Medici. These two women being Queen of England and Queen and then Queen Mother to the King of France, never actually met in person, but obviously negotiations between France and England were fairly turbulent, it is fair to say, during this time. And so this was a really interesting perspective to get, to see all of those political dynamics filtered through letters and emissaries, but also being able to get a sense of what each of those women thought of the other, despite the fact that it was built up by just hearsay, what they had heard from other people. Next up was Lady of the English by Elizabeth Chadwick. This was historical fiction looking at the life of Empress Matilda, who we know is one of my favourite historical figures, going from the death of her first husband Henry, her return to England, her being proclaimed the heir to the throne, and then subsequently that throne being stolen from her, and the civil war that ensued. I have been a little bit sceptical of reading Empress Matilda historical fiction, and I'm not going to lie to you, I didn't necessarily warm to this one. This is kind of split between the perspective of Matilda and Adeliza of Louvain, who was her stepmother, and personally I just didn't feel like the Adeliza chapters really added anything. I also found all of the personal relationships between Matilda and the men in her life just a little bit awkward and forced. I particularly didn't like the relationship between her and her second husband Geoffrey, a little icky, and I didn't enjoy reading those passages. Another historical fiction about a time that I love learning about, which was also unfortunately a bit of a disappointment to me, was Firebrand by Elizabeth Fremantle. I wanted to read this ahead of watching the film. This is looking at the Tudor court from the perspective of Henry VIII's sixth wife Catherine Parr, and yeah, unfortunately I just found this a little bit bit dull. Catherine Parr is already a little bit of a hard sell for me, and I just didn't feel like this added anything. Well, actually no, it did add something. It added the inclusion of Catherine being a bit of a witchy wise woman, which is a trope that we know that I hate. I don't know what it is about historical fiction writers and why they incessantly have to pair being smart and intelligent and being somewhat different to being kind of witchy, but I don't appreciate it, and I feel like it is just lazy historical fiction writing. However, a historical fiction that I did really enjoy was The Instrumentalist by Harriet Constable. This is looking at Anna Maria, who was an orphan living at the Ospedale della Pieta, an orphanage for young girls where they were trained up as musicians, and it becomes very clear very early that she is a particularly gifted violinist. She goes on to be tutored by Antonio Vivaldi, and then as she gets older, as their relationship grows, as the world that she is in becomes more competitive and more restrictive, pressure's really bearing down on her to survive this world. She then is horrified to learn that Antonio Vivaldi is actually stealing some of her compositions and passing them off for his own. I love this. I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was so evocative. The atmosphere, while so oppressive and actually very restrictive, was just depicted so vividly. The Lady Elizabeth by Alison Weir. This is looking at the early life of Elizabeth I. I read a lot of books about Elizabeth I this year. I had previously read The Marriage Game, which looked at her life from her reign to her death. This is looking at the point of her mother Anne Boleyn's execution up until she is told that she is now queen. And what looking at her early life really does is really getting a chance to look at Elizabeth's worldview and how it grows and changes following her mother's death, the execution of Catherine Howard, the death at childbirth of her stepmother Catherine Parr, how it really shapes her attitudes to marriage, her political acumen, Elizabeth's own early controversies and times where she butted heads with whoever was in charge, and how that really shaped her perspective on operating within the Tudor court going forward, deciding that she needed to be a lot more pragmatic and really keep her head down. Similarly to Anna of Clever, there is a particular choice that Alison Weir makes about how to deal with one controversial aspect of Elizabeth I's life, which I wasn't really a massive fan of, and so that kind of dipped this a little bit for me, but otherwise was quite evocative. Messalina by Anna Cargill Martin is non-fiction, looking at Valeria Messalina, who is the third very controversial wife of the Emperor Claudius, and this really digs into her very scandalous reputation and trying to decide whether or not that was really fair. I'm kind of dipping my toe into non-fiction about the Roman Empire. While I'm a big fan of a myth retelling, actual non-fiction about the ancient world is something that I'm a little bit less versed in. But this was really interesting, really compelling, giving me a bit of a snapshot into Messalina and how historians have chosen to depict her. Another Alison Weir that I read this year was The Captive Queen. This one I probably liked a little bit better, looking at the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine and particularly her marriage to Henry II, which to say it was turbulent and tumultuous as well as very passionate is to put it lightly. At points I couldn't necessarily tell if I was finding it fascinating because I just generally find Eleanor of Aquitaine fascinating, or if it was Alison Weir's writing. I am slightly inclined to feel like it was just Eleanor of Aquitaine being really fantastic rather than anything that Alison Weir was necessarily doing, which seems like a harsh thing to say, but there was a bit of a sparkle about this book that I didn't really find, which I have found in other historical fiction that Alison Weir has written. I feel like I was most engaged because I knew what was coming next than necessarily by the writing. And then we had a bit of a gap for a while of me reading anything that was women's history related, and then the other day I ended up reading On Being Ill by Virginia Woolf, which is a short little book. It is an essay that she wrote in 1926 about living with illness, I think particularly chronic illness, and basically how society treats you and others you when you are ill, and how it affects your ability to just generally engage with the world. I feel like I have been very fortunate in my life to generally have been a well person, but it is something that, especially as I'm getting older, I am thinking a lot more about, is not taking my body for granted and really treasuring this time that I am well, because unfortunately it is not the case for a lot of people. And I know eventually the experiences that I was reading about in this essay are going to be applicable to my life. It is applicable to a lot of people in my life currently, and really kind of checking myself on where I have maybe not been as empathetic and compassionate to those people as I really should have been. This, mixed with Virginia Woolf's very characteristic kind of more stream of consciousness style, meant that this was an essay I actually read twice. I'm not gonna lie to you, the first time the stream of consciousness kind of dragged me away from the main point, but it was after going back to it again. But I was kind of able to see the wood for the trees on this one and really follow her train of thought in a way that the first time around hadn't quite landed for me. But I think a really, really important book, and one that I would definitely add to the list of books that everybody should read, because one way or another this is going to become relevant to to everybody, whether it is yourself, whether it is people who you love, and we could all benefit from being that little bit more compassionate and considerate of what other people are going through than I think necessarily society always is. So there we go, those are the 11 books about women of the past that I read in 2024 and beginning of 2025, and I'm hoping that next year I'm going to be able to give you a lot more recommendations. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I've spoken to you about down in the comments below. Alternatively, let me know about a great women's history book, whether fiction or non-fiction, that you yourself have read this past year and enjoyed. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.